crisis is emerging, beginning with the public or beginning with the media, not something that you see coming from the inside, what are the first steps that communications people should take right away? And Jeff, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Sure. You know, I almost want to back up, Cass and folks, to say that a crisis shouldn't be emerging for you to first take action as a crisis communication manager or person responsible. You want to act before a crisis even occurs. You want to be taking those steps, and responsible organizations do this, where you have a team, a crisis team put in place. You have scenarios that are could reasonably be expected to occur for your organization. I'm sure Mason can share some of those with his experience representing a university in Washington State. And Dave certainly can speak to this at the Red Cross. But I often look to see who have you put together around the table before a crisis occurs, so you can call them on a second's notice to come together and make sure that you're dealing with it. In a perfect world, and it's not perfect, you are dealing and preparing for this before something emerges. Unfortunately, at least in my case, 70% or so of what I do, the proverbial you-know-what hits the fan, and then you get the phone call. But really need to reverse that trend and have that before any crisis occurs.
Okay, Mason, let's go to you to follow up. What are some of the first things that people should do when something is starting to hit the fan, if you will?
Absolutely. Well, if you do have those proactive crisis communication plans in place, you want to follow those and immediately deploy them to everyone that could be involved. If you don't have those, or if you do not know exactly what's going on, you need to gather the facts. And you do that by calling all the stakeholders that might have that information, understand what the situation is and what is happening, and then if you don't have an answer to something, understand what's being done to finish that and to get that information.
Got it. And Dave, to you, what are some of the first things that people should do?
I'm going to piggyback a little bit off Mason with a little example that I was working with the Red Cross. I got a phone call 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning from a reporter saying that one of the Red Cross trucks had struck and killed somebody.
Okay.
And I was like, oh my gosh. But I didn't take necessarily what the reporter said at face value. That was their first report. I didn't just say, oh my, I didn't come up with an immediate statement. I didn't sit there and go, well, it wasn't us. This is the worst, I said, give me a half an hour, 45 minutes, buy me some time to figure out what happened here. Called around, turned out that it was a contractor that worked for a division that we do business with. Now, the person identified themselves as I was on a delivery for the Red Cross, but he didn't work for us. He didn't drive off. And the person turned out was in the middle of the night, ran out in the middle of the road. So as the facts played out, it wasn't, Red Cross didn't really do anything wrong, right? The person was totally responsible. So you can't just assume that what the facts you're being told are accurate or are the full story. So that was a good example of doing your own fact check and being your own reporter. And it's critical to have people in place you can call on very short notice, more than one. Like you need to have multiple phone numbers. Can't just be one person. They can be on vacation. They cannot answer their phone. I mean, those are the little simple things that really can make a huge difference in an outcome. So I think that was a really good example of how I didn't really jump to conclusion. I didn't really panic. I was like, I was worried, but I didn't panic, and I knew I had a sense of what I needed to do next.
Cass?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to add in. I think it's an important point that these guys brought up, which is you have the tension between speed and accuracy in crisis response, and accuracy always needs to win out. My two colleagues just said that, and there's 3 words I always say in training that it's okay to say to a reporter at the time when you're getting you're on the hot seat, which is, I don't know. And that buys you the time, and you find out their deadline, and you get back to them, even if you don't know all the facts. But I can't echo that enough. And it's tough because you want to say something, but at least that buys you some time. So I want to make sure that that's absolutely echoed as well.
Yeah, and I would just like to say that the point is well taken that in a crisis situation, especially one that is evolving and changing very, very quickly, it's important for communications people to kind of take a deep breath, right? Just to say, okay, I have to be the even-keeled, the level-headed one. Let me take a deep breath and understand what's really going on here. So we all know, though, that crises don't always originate externally. Quite often, we have an opportunity to maybe see something coming internally before everybody else knows about it. Mason, I know you've had some of that experience. So when a crisis is emerging from within an organization but hasn't quite publicly come out yet, or not everybody knows about it yet, what are some of the things that communications people should do first?
Absolutely. It's similar to all crises in that you should gather the facts that you do have access to as quickly as you can and make sure that they are 100% accurate, or as accurate as can be. Once you know that, you need to identify also who's going to be involved from this organization. What kind of crisis is it? Is it isolated to one department? Is it isolated to one individual? And once you identify that, you can start to think externally. So if you can get everyone on your team internally on the same page, you can develop a strategic plan on how you're going to communicate that and make sure that everyone involved has the information they need. Once it becomes external, you're already there and you are being proactive. And that's really key.
Dave, same question to you. When you see something emerging internally but it hasn't quite come public yet.
Yeah, Mason's hits on a couple of key points there. My primary goal is to make sure that everyone understands the gravity of it, that it's not just a PR person's problem, right? That you can't say, okay, now you go fix it, Dave. We screwed up, now you go fix it with everybody else. Like, that can't be the response. And so long as everyone is on board that this is a group effort, then that, to me, that's the first step in making sure that they have a stake in the outcome here. They have a stake in coming clean, for lack of a better phrase. They have a stake in being helpful in any way they can. So that would be my top piece of advice.
And Jeff, same question.
Sure. I'll just add on that, first be thankful that it isn't public yet, because you have the opportunity to shape the narrative or shape your message. And for me, it's your opportunity as a crisis team internally, your organization, to put together your talking points, your standby statements. So I often think of, okay, when it does become public, what are the things we're going to say, how are we going to say it, and who's going to say it, and when are we going to say it to the different audiences that matter most to our organization. So even doing things like having a dark web page. When I mean dark is having something that isn't launched and live yet, but has a statement that you could push go on your computer and be ready at a moment's notice. Having statements that are vetted internally, so when it does break and the media is calling and showing up at your doorstep, you're prepared. You know who's going to speak and what. These are opportunities when you see these so-called warning signs or emerging crises happen in your organization. And of course, then there's the policies. What are the policies that employees need to be reminded about, whether it relates to social media, which I know we're going to speak about here very shortly, and what they can and cannot say, who's responsible, and so forth. That's important to reiterate at times like these.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of social media, we are taking your questions live via Twitter. You can tweet them at SliceComm, SLICECOMM, or using the hashtag SWEBINAR. Okay, let's talk about crisis communications in the age of social media. Do you think it helps or hinders response? Dave, to you first.
Both. It hinders it in the sense that it's you versus everybody else. I mean, if it's bad news, right? That you can't control 50 million Twitter users. You can only really control what you say and your immediate stakeholders. So that part of it hinders you, that you can't get to everything. There's no way you can possibly keep track of everything that's said. It helps because it's quick and easy and relatively cheap, and if you do it right, it'd be effective. Red Cross, another great example. I encourage everyone to sort of Google this as a great test case. But one of our heads of our social media team she managed both accounts, and she was tweeting from the Red Cross account when she thought she was tweeting from her personal account. Mm-hmm. And she tweeted out that she was having a great time, that she was getting slizzard. I encourage you to go to that hashtag getting slizzard. And it's a very famous case, and it was a major screw up. People thought, it was funny but not funny. But it turned into an opportunity where it was handled very, very well by her bosses. And it turned into actually a donation situation because she talked about Dogfish Brewery in her tweet. So it sort of turned into a fundraising campaign that Dogfish Brewery took it very well, and they supported the Red Cross as, hey, you know, these things happen, and it turned into an opportunity. So the same people that were kind of bashing and then turning around going, hey, this is actually a pretty smart way to handle it. So it can be used both ways.
Okay, Jeff, same question. Help or hindrance?
Well, the immediate answer is just like Dave, so I'm boring both. I think from our world, everyone that's participating today, it's actually made it, it's an opportunity, but the challenge is immense because it's 24/7. Beforehand, in the old days, as they say, you know, you would have time. You get a call from a reporter, you prepare your response, you get back to the reporter, people read about it in the newspaper or see it on the news later or the next day. Well, we know that's gone to you-know-where, hell in a handbasket. And the other challenge is truth doesn't matter. And what is the credibility of those that are tweeting or those that are posting on Facebook? I'm working right now with an organization that had a tremendous crisis in a restaurant with some things that shouldn't have been there, rodent infestation. Well, you can imagine the pictures and the jokes that have come out about that, and the truth doesn't always matter. But it's about perception, not reality. Image is everything, and in social media, it's democratized. So it doesn't matter who it is, and that's very, very scary. But I guess from a business standpoint, it's wonderful, but it's very scary from an organizational reputation perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mason, same question.
I have to agree with both of them that it is both. It both helps and hinders. I like to look at it from whether that crisis is internal or external. When it's an external crisis, social media gives you the opportunity to reach a huge audience with your messaging and also interact with them. It's an immense challenge because that is so many people you have to communicate with, but that's a new medium that we now have access to. But when it's an internal crisis, social media makes it very difficult. While I was at the university, we had an issue where there was a high-profile termination, and a lot of people had strongly worded opinions on this internally to the organization. We had our own social media policy about what employees and student volunteers could say and should say on their social media, but at the same time, we can't control that to a certain level. So we found ourselves in a situation where people were tweeting about the details of this termination, yet from the PR perspective, we couldn't communicate a lot of those details due to university policy and state law. And we had to quickly access how we could work with these individuals to curtail the details they were releasing, but at the same time, not stifle their freedom of speech. And again, in a university environment, you're dealing with so many different mediums and so many different perspectives that it becomes a big challenge.
Yeah, and there have been some recent court rulings that just reinforced freedom of speech on individual social media channels, and employers are having a harder and harder time kind of combating that and bringing it in. Okay. So when I was a young PR person, I remember being told that the golden rule of crisis communications is validate concern and show action. What does that mean today? Jeff, I'll start with you.
I think it's timeless, and that was good advice that you got. There's something to be said for expressing concern, and social media is a difficult place to do that, except if you're showing video. How you say things, how you communicate can be every bit as important as what you communicate. When you communicate immediately, even if it's not saying much, is as important as sometimes what you're communicating. People don't necessarily remember the message that you state, but they remember, do you express empathy? Do you express concern? Do you take responsibility, and are you accountable? Doesn't mean you're admitting guilt. Certainly there's the court of law, which we have. It's a very different place than sometimes in the court of public opinion. But in the court of public opinion, perception is everything. So, and then the second part, showing action, couldn't agree more with that timeless advice as well. Even if you're just acknowledging getting a phone call from a reporter, or you're returning their call, telling a customer that, you know what, I'm going to get back to you by the end of the day, telling investors that you're going to have a call by the end of the week. I mean, it goes a long way versus being a turtle and putting your head in the sand that a lot of people do, a lot of very smart executives do. There's nothing worse than that. Inaction is a message in and of itself that says, like, no comment, I'm hiding something.
Dave or Mason, anything to add?
Well, first, I think Jeff pretty much hit all the key points. I would always just echo that it is, yeah, doing it over Twitter seems, you're not going to get the full effect. If you truly are empathetic, Twitter is not going to be a good way to portray that. So they need to find a way, either an extended statement is posted as well to the Twitter 140 characters. So I think that I would try to avoid Twitter. I mean, include it, but it wouldn't be your primary source. Real quick, Cass, the second worst nightmare to a communicator is their phone dying from battery. So I'm going to step away and just quickly get my charger. I'll be gone in 45 seconds, all right?
No problem. I'll use this break to encourage people to send us your questions. We're definitely here to take them. We've already received some, and we will certainly get to them. But keep sending us your questions. And if you know Dave's number, you can text him. Now that he has his phone charger, I'm sure we'll get questions that way too. Okay, until Dave comes back, I'm going to start with Jeff and Mason on this question. Most of us in PR and communications love hearing the war stories about crisis situations and how they were handled. What is one of your favorite, or I should probably say most informative, case studies? Mason?
Yeah, my favorite is the Tylenol cyanide poisoning. It was 1982, before my time, but it was a really pinnacle case study for the industry because it set the standard for what crisis communication should entail. So for those of you who don't know, in 1982, it was the fall, Tylenol bottles of their extra strength Tylenol were found to be tainted with cyanide poisoning. And it created this huge storm of media attention because the communications weren't there to establish whether or not it was related to the Tylenol itself or whether it was a poisoning. And Tylenol, as a company, did a great job handling that because they not only immediately started communicating about it and let them know that if they didn't have the facts, this is what they were doing to get those facts, but they also pulled the product off the shelves at a huge monetary cost to them. But what that did, instead of being defensive once they knew it wasn't their product, it was a poisoning, they actually did a proactive approach and made it seem as if they were taking consumer safety as seriously as they could have in that situation. And they were doing that. And it was a great example of how they maintained their brand integrity throughout that crisis.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That is certainly a classic. Jeff, what is one of your favorite or most informative case studies?
Yeah, of course, like I'm drawing a blank on like the most, think of all the bad ones. If I could spend a moment just comparing two things that I had the opportunity to work on, one more recent than the other, they both have to do with restaurant establishments, one in the city, one in the burbs. You might be able to guess which one or ones after I talk about it, and it's public, so I'm not speaking out of turn. I'll see this up on Twitter. Both restaurants, one had a woman come by after they were closed and took a picture of rats eating out of pizza boxes in what was at one time Philadelphia Magazine's Best Place to Eat Brunch. That showed up on NBC 10 because she tweeted the photo out, and immediately that became the butt of many jokes and the disgust of the general public. That restaurant in the city had to close for a certain period of time. And I'll get to the other one, and then I'll tell you what they did quickly. The other one is frankly perhaps still ongoing. What has been rated as perhaps the #1 Chinese restaurant in the entire country recently had major failure in its health inspection due to rodent infestation and unsanitary conditions that should have been taken care of, frankly. But here's what both of them did, and I'm doing this in a much more condensed fashion, so please excuse me. I'm happy to elaborate maybe in Q&A. Both apologized for any conditions that they certainly were responsible for not handling, and most importantly, they were transparent in the follow-up. And here's what I mean. They had to open up their doors once they made the renovations and did the cleaning and did all the things they needed to do to show the public, not just tell the public, what they did to clean up these messes. Open it up to reporters to take pictures, to go on tours, to try to engender some confidence that people would come back and patronize these restaurants. The first one, it's been 3 or 4 years. They've come back pretty strong, and people don't talk about it anymore in terms of the rats. The second one, we're going to find out, but they did reopen, and they've actually done okay so far, but it's still fresh in people's minds, and they have a lot to do. So one of the things they're doing this weekend is having a community open house where anybody that really would like to see the kitchen, would like to go into the basement, in addition to eating food, is welcome to do so. So the only thing they can do is open themselves up, be transparent, be accountable, and take the hit, the financial hit, the reputation hit, and realize you're not going to please everybody, but all you can do is try to do the right thing after you've made the mistake.
Thank you. And Dave, what is one of your favorite or most informative case studies?
For my personally, we had instances when I was with the Red Cross. I used to get these all the time where we'd have, after a fire or something like that, where people would be they had to leave the hotel we were putting them up at, or they were Red Cross house. People had to leave. So, and they would call the media and say the Red Cross is kicking me out, right? So every single time that would happen, it would be I'd have to go back and gather up what exactly is happening, what are we doing, that sort of thing. And most of the time, we followed all the procedures. And if that's the case, the reporter will most of the time drop the story, which is always my #1 priority. But hey, sometimes if you have your rules and your rules are reasonable and you are doing things right, don't be ashamed of that. Don't pretend like, oh no, that's not really what's happening, because eventually you're gonna get busted for that. Eventually that's gonna come back to haunt you in some way, shape, or form, where the situation is going to be different and you're going to handle it differently. Well, what back then you did it this way? And so, hey, be transparent is a great word for it. It's like, hey, own what you do. This is our procedures, and maybe we can review them at some point if we find out that this is not the best system. But not at some point there's a limit to what you can accommodate, what you can't. And I think that's, as a business or an organization, you have to own that and be prepared to talk about it and be proud about it, not ashamed and hide from it.
Cool. So I am going to get into some case studies now that I'm going to pose to each of you. Some of these are still in the news. So the first one is Volkswagen. A group of scientists, here's the background on it. A group of scientists from West Virginia University were conducting a study on cars and their engines. They were hired by the International Council on Clean Transportation to conduct basic emissions tests on Volkswagen cars. And VW had been hyping their product as the most environmentally friendly car out there. After testing 2 VW vehicles, it became apparent that something was not right. They discovered the cars were equipped with a quote-unquote defeat device, which allowed them to manipulate emissions tests in their favor to help bolster environmentally friendly claims. The scientists passed their information on to the organization that hired them, and they passed it on to the Environmental Protection Agency. When the story broke, VW put a statement out on their website that basically addressed the inconsistencies that were found during the testing of their diesel cars, but took no ownership of wrongdoing. The acting CEO was fired, and Michael Horn was brought in as the new CEO. A few days after the story broke, VW put up a video of Michael Horn explaining the situation and taking some accountability on behalf of the organization. The video to some seemed inauthentic, dry, and people could tell that he was reading from a script. Jeff, how do you think VW should have handled this situation differently?
Well, they did the one thing that there's no excuse for, and apologies aren't enough. They lied. And once you lied, of course, of something this nature and of an organization this large, this international organization, they may not come back. In terms of how they could have handled it differently, or could be handling it differently, since it's still pretty fresh, I mean, they did do the one thing. I mean, the action here is more important than empathy. Apologizing is not good enough. Action, firing the acting CEO, removing anybody that could have, that's proved to have been involved in this situation, needs to be removed immediately. And anyone suspected of being involved could perhaps not necessarily be terminated, but could be put on temporary leave while an investigation by an outside independent organization could take place to get to the bottom of this. Action is the only thing here that's going to possibly get these folks back into the game. But I think it was Dave that talked about brand, and this is Volkswagen's brand is shattered because they went out as this quirk hippie, environmentally friendly, young-oriented organization of Cars Popular with this group, and lawsuits are going to be going on for years now. I don't know if they'll be able to come back from this. One of the other lessons that I think is important for communicators here, if we were, if one of us was representing them, which I'm certainly not, is dealing with the culture that's a German company. If those of us have to work with organizations, cultures in different countries, of course, are very different. And the German culture, from what I understand, I'm no guru here, is pretty harsh in the sense of how businesses operate. They're not used to apologizing. They're not used to being empathetic, frankly. So I think all they can do is continue to take actions and express those actions, because that's going to speak a lot louder than any apologies at this point will do and have.
Yeah, Dave, what do you think they could have done better?
This falls into, I kind of characterize crises in 3 buckets, and this is obviously the most severe of the 3 buckets. There's the well-meaning but poorly executed idea that you meant no harm, but somewhere along the line somebody screwed up, right? That's usually very forgivable. People understand that we're human. That's the wayward tweet. That's the statement that you probably shouldn't have said, or you said it wrong. But this is one of those. This falls in the bucket of deliberately deceiving people for self-interest. In this case, money. I mean, that's like the worst. That's the worst offense that VW committed here. And the idea of firing all the leadership and the people who are responsible is great. The next step needs to be, you need to follow through on that. You need to say what changes you've made, and you need to make it public what those are and follow up consistently. You can't just do a one-time thing. Oh, we fired everybody. Now please go on your way. Nothing to see here. Like that's, you have, to me, they should be proactively talking about, these are the controls we put in place. These are the systems we have changed. Be very transparent about it. And I think that's really the only way. There has to be, you have to convince the public that this is never going to happen again with this new leadership, and that we realized what we did wrong. It wasn't just we did wrong because we got caught. Gee, this is really bad. This was a bad thing we did, and we're going to fix it. That's, to me, and you have to be convincing. The only way to convince people of that is to show what you've done differently. And it remains to see whether or not they can pull that off.
Yeah. Mason, thoughts on VW? I know that you just blogged about this topic for our website.
I did, and I am a car enthusiast myself, so this one hits home. I used to own a Volkswagen TDI. The issue here for me was really about brand communication. I think Volkswagen ignored their strongest audience in this situation by not providing detailed and strategic information to those that will be their brand advocates. So if you look at a lot of the coverage in the automotive magazines or the automotive blogs online, there's a lot of Volkswagen had declined to comment, or we don't know at this time. And those statements are damaging because when you look at what's going to happen in the general public, people like myself who know about cars, we're the ones being asked by our friends, hey, what's going on with Volkswagen? Or, hey, should I buy a TDI still? And we don't have the information to give them. And I think companies often ignore this when they're responding to a crisis because they only provide that statement out and they work to provide that coverage for the general population. But they ignore those channels that then become very vocal about those specific issues.
Yeah, can I address that real quick? As part of it, when I was with the Red Cross, and I still do volunteer stuff for them, one of the biggest things we emphasized was our advocates. That anytime there was negative or potentially negative or damaging, it's like we circle the wagons, really, and say, hey, we have so many people on our side, so many advocates for us. Let's give them the message and empower them to speak on our behalf. That it's not just coming from the Red Cross Twitter account. It's coming from Marianne Smith in Orlando, Florida. She's the one doing the message. She's the one posting it to her Facebook page saying, the Red Cross is a wonderful organization. That's the kind of stuff that he's talking about that really was effective in sort of drowning out the anti-Red Cross comments, or if not drowning out, at least tempering them to a large degree. And I think that is, you're right, is sometimes is underappreciated in how important that can be.
It really surprised me in this situation, too, how long it took Volkswagen to address owners. I mean, I have plenty of friends, being from Washington State, a very environmentally friendly place, that own Volkswagen diesels, and it took them weeks to get the information they needed about their own cars. I mean, they're driving around not knowing what this whole scandal is, but yet hearing about it left and right in the media. And I think that was really detrimental.
Yeah. I just want to add that there was a recent story on the This American Life radio show and podcast where they talked about this issue, and some other people have weighed in on what Volkswagen should do to make it right. So I will tweet out that link if anybody wants to listen. It's a great and easy listen. Okay, let's move to a crisis that started on Twitter, because we know that's happening quite a bit today. So somehow US Airways official Twitter account tweeted a picture of a naked woman with a toy airplane inserted into a personal area. It seems as though maybe someone from US Airways had cut and pasted the link to that image, and instead of linking to the airline's customer service page in Twitter, instead pasted the link into an image in the tweet. And you can Google this. It is not safe for work, the photo. I will just caution everybody about that photo. But Dave, I'll start with you on this one. What could they have done better, or what should they have done differently, or what did they do well?
Well, again, this goes back to one of those buckets that was just a unintended consequence, that there was no ill will here, there was no malfeasance, it was just an employee making a mistake that's cruelly very embarrassing for the company. But I think it's one of those things where ultimately the public is forgiven, will forgive you for it, because it could be one of them, right? And that could have been, anyone could have done something, potentially, not that bad, but you have a sense of like, gee, it's an easy mistake to make. So I think you're a little bit more forgiven. They did address it. They did apologize, and it was sincere, because you got the sense that they were cruelly embarrassed by it. And I don't, other than the fodder for jokes, I don't really think it's had a long-term impact on their brand. I mean, the airline is still going very strong, and I think the sort of the after effects was much more of a punchline than an actual damage to the brand.
Mason, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think in this case, it's more on the comical side of a Twitter error. You can see a couple different trends with issues on Twitter. Companies either tweet out something that was inadvertently offensive or directly targeted at a group. That's when people are trying to tweet from their personal but accidentally do it through their company pages. Or when a company just obviously blatantly is erroneous in what they post, but it's not targeted at a population. In this case, that's the better situation, because again, it's humorous for a lot of people, it's offensive to some, but it's also, in general, it's not that damaging to their brand, and it was obviously done in error. And that's easier to get out of, and I think they did a good job in addressing that. It was interesting in that you don't see too much on the how did this happen side. A lot of the articles, I mean, BuzzFeed, of course, covered this immediately, didn't speak to what happened there, and I don't think US Airways addressed that. But at the same time, it wasn't that important, because after the hype of it died off, I don't think anyone really cared.
Jeff, thoughts on this case?
Sure, I'll just add, every crisis is an opportunity. And what I mean there is US Airways has plenty of real, quote-unquote, issues about their brand when it relates to luggage being delivered on time, or on-time flights, or friendliness of the customer service representatives, etc. Those are real issues. This one, while horribly embarrassing, as folks said, it provides an opportunity, frankly, for them to not use humor per se, but to, when they apologize and it's authentic, to be more relatable to the public. And so while this is a horrible example of something gone awry, I look at it, if I was representing US Airways, as take opportunity here to really communicate in an authentic way, nothing to do with flying per se in terms of true issues about what they do day to day, but to be human, to humanize US Airways, which frankly I don't think they do a very good job of overall, but that's another issue. On this case, they did do it. And I think that I look at crises as being opportunities for organizations. That's my takeaway here.
Got it. Okay, we're going to do one more, and then we're going to jump into viewer questions. Let's talk about a media-generated crisis, and this one is still in the news. 2 months ago, the New York Times published the results of an investigation of Amazon's work environment, calling it, quite, the meanest company of the tech era, regularly reducing many of its employees to tears. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos and its new PR chief, former Obama White House spokesman Jay Carney, immediately protested this characterization. Last week, the company once again responded to the investigation, which at this point is about 2 months old, this time with its own investigation of Amazon employees or former employees who were quoted in the article about instances of Amazon's harshness. Jay Carney wrote a blog post attacking the Times and espousing the value of fact-checking. That blog post just showed up on the internet not long ago. Mason, you're from Amazon's home state of Washington, so I'm going to start with you on this one. What did Amazon do wrong? What did they do right? And what could they have done better in this situation?
Absolutely. This crisis for Amazon is one that's very complicated. So in Seattle, there's a large shift with the tech industry. Everyone's saying it's the new San Francisco. And what that means is prices of rent and cost of living have risen dramatically. There's issues of not enough space. Traffic has gotten worse. And this has created a political issue within that community. The problem for Amazon is that they're addressing this New York Times coverage at a national level, but they're ignoring this population of people who live there, and they're not addressing those issues. So while they get to that point where they're putting out a statement or writing about the New York Times focus, this population down here is continuing to generate more negativity. So every time they get up and they address something, it comes back down because they're not actually looking at the root of the issue. In terms of how they addressed the New York Times article specifically, I think there was things they could have done better. Generally in a crisis, when you attack the integrity of a journalist or a journalistic entity, especially as one as notable as the New York Times, it doesn't work out in your favor. And that's something that they really shouldn't have done in that tone.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, thoughts on the Amazon New York Times crisis?
Yeah, what strikes me here, and I want to make a comparison, a local one, before I go back to you, is I keep hearing, and you shared, we'll do our own investigation. We'll have our spokesperson, who happens to be the former political spokesperson for President Obama. So consider the source. Again, brilliant guy, would love to have his experience. That being said, as an audience, you're saying this is their spokesperson. He comes out of politics. He's the Obama guy before this, and he's defending the company and attacking the credibility, as Mason just said, of the journalist. The pen is always mightier than the sword. So really disagree with how they went about it. And obviously they validated the New York Times a little bit by going back and having the blog post, not just letting it, not that they should have necessarily let it lie, but then going back and attacking them again. I want to contrast this for a moment, though, with a local example. If anyone saw the Daily News today, probably on Philly.com, you can see it too. Urban Outfitters, local company. They're the ones who seem to constantly get away with it. Because their brand is quirky and they're bohemian. There's an article today that talks about how they treat part-time workers as needing to be on call, in essence, not knowing their schedules. And in that way, they're always having to be ready to go to work within 3 hours, and then they don't get paid if they don't get called to go into work. It's not really fair. It's certainly, if I didn't name the company, I think everybody on this webinar would say they sound like really bad people. But when I mention the name Urban Outfitters, it often ends up mixed up. They have countless examples of being an environment, or excuse me, of putting out items that are beyond politically reprehensible, Nazi symbols on shirts. And here's an example where I contrast this to Volkswagen as well a little bit, or in some cases the same, is, boy, are they ever going to get caught, if you will? Will people stop shopping there? It hasn't happened yet, it seems. But I know I'm not answering the question, but I want to contrast it, though, to say that every organization has its own personality and its own culture. And here's one locally in our backyard that seems to get away with things that other organizations do not get away with.
Mm-hmm. Dave, thoughts on the Amazon New York Times situation?
I'm a little bit torn because I'm one of those deals where I'm kind of like, nothing. I mean, without knowing the facts of whether or not what they said is true or not true and all that, to me, the backlash, I'm not sure where the backlash lies. Is the backlash, I mean, is Amazon sales going down?
Right.
Are they losing partners? The answer to that question is no. That I don't see the point of always revisiting it. I think the general public, for the most part, is kind of like probably not terribly surprised that a big company that makes a lot of money is, employees work hard and are, that, to me, I don't think the general public is outraged. The outrage seems to be coming from people inside the industry or wherever in the media, but the general public doesn't care. So why continue to put it out there if the backlash is really mostly internal, for lack of a better phrase? That's kind of how I viewed that. It seems like Amazon making much ado about very little.
It's interesting that this is refusing to die in a way, this issue, because Amazon keeps bringing it back up when at the same time they're trying to hire a tremendous amount of people to put up with all of the holiday demand and deal with all the holiday demand. So I will be curious if they have trouble after this holiday season recruiting and adding and keeping people, or if not, if they don't have that trouble.
Well,
okay,
one quick point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, I just want to say Amazon is like Walmart now, in the sense of it's actually market cap, I think, is bigger than Walmart now, and they're in essence like a political candidate that people are going to go out and against. That people are going to be looking at their political contributions. They hired, obviously, they're running it like their communications similar to political campaign here, and they are with the drone push too. They are in essence, they have their own corporate personality, and you're going to see workplace issues. This is not going away. And they will become, I think this could even filter in, as amongst like Walmart always does, into the 2016 elections as to how individuals, maybe someone who work off-site, and Mason, you were there, you know how folks work remotely and what have you, could be an issue. So more to come, I think.
I'd like to add, too, from the local perspective, people in Seattle have known that Amazon's been a tough place to work for years. I mean, we also are the headquarters to Microsoft. There's tons of other tech firms there. It was interesting for me to see that Amazon became vilified in such a way in the media. Yes, there were specific instances there that were newsworthy, and that's why that coverage started. But it wasn't that shocking to us. I think what was fascinating about it was how shocking and how much traction this got with the national media and with the general population about an issue that was so localized and so understood already. So it goes to show that if you don't address those local issues, you don't address all of those details, they can sometimes spiral out of control and turn into this national level story.
So thank you. We have less than 15 minutes left, and I want to try to get to as many viewer questions as we can. Here's the first one. What are the best heads-up tips for a small company, given the current 24/7 nature of social media, where crises can erupt in a heartbeat? Jeff, I'm going to you first on this one.
Listen, all of us have access to tools that are free or very relatively inexpensive. Here I think of things like TweetDeck. Things that allow you to monitor what is going on in the world of corporate America or organizations. It's being absolutely vigilant, and that's sweat. That's not necessarily having a big bank account. So small agency, large agency, what have you, they may have more technology at larger agencies, but everything, especially because of the internet, is becoming much more democratized. There are free tools. It's getting use of those, getting a handle on those tools, being absolutely just one step ahead, being hungrier. Being a small agency or a small shop, you don't have the bureaucracy that large agencies have. You don't have to get approvals through many layers. Go at it, be hungrier, and you also provide probably more individualized attention to your prospective or your current clients. That's the image, I think, that at least that could be portrayed as to why you would be the right fit for a crisis project.
Dave, tips for small companies or nonprofits?
Well, for the nonprofit world, obviously there's budgetary concerns, but again, there are lots of tools. I was an avid fan of Hootsuite and TweetDeck, huge fan of both. Use them all the time to search terms and just find great stakeholders for the future, no question about it. They became a source of interaction. In other words, that's where I started pitching things, and that's where I was able to get a lot of story ideas out there, is connecting one-on-one with these reporters. You don't have their email address, but you know what? You have their Twitter handle, right? That's a lot easier to find than an email address to get your story out. So that's a good piece of advice. I would also make sure that you're pursuing. When you're smaller, I mean, you might not always have this option, but if you can, pursue things that you're passionate about. That's going to come across to the people you serve and your clients, as well as the people you pitch to, or whatever you're called to do. If you're not passionate about the clients you represent, it's going to come across. And as someone who used to be on the receiving end of those emails from people saying, "Hey, I got this greatest book author," and 5 minutes later I would get an email, exact same, it was a different book, and it's from the exact same person. You're just like, wait a minute. So you need to make sure that you're picking your clients that are in tune to your brand, what you want your brand to be. If you have that really flexibility to be a little more selective, I think that is important to make sure you focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Mason, tips for small companies.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that anyone should do is start talking about it now, way before crisis happens. Even if you're a small organization and you don't need a ton of crisis plans or proactive strategy, just discuss what would happen. Who would be your first spokesperson? Or, hey, do we have phone numbers for all of the staff as well as email addresses or home phones? Just get that conversation going now so that you can think of ways that your organization might have a small weakness and you can address that before you get to a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, another viewer question. What role should the CEO play in addressing an unexpected crisis, and how can he or she best support a crisis communications plan? Dave, thought?
It depends on the level of the problem. If the problem is institutional, then I think that's definitely a CEO matter. The CEO has to be the one out front. If it's a kind of a one-off, kind of a rare thing that maybe didn't rise to his level or her level, then it might not be in your best interest to do that. You don't want to drag the CEO into something that the CEO probably had very little to or nothing to do with. So that's a balancing act. And if your CEO is not comfortable, that's probably not, and they haven't done many media things, that's probably not the best time for them to learn. Crisis is not a good place to learn on-the-job training. So you have to sort of assess that as well. But certainly CEO will need to be involved in the solution. If they're not the spokesperson, you certainly want them involved in fixing it. So, and again, that goes to the sort of the next level down the chain, where after the immediate crisis is over, are you following up and doing what you said you were going to do? That's when I think it would be very important for the CEO to be out in front.
Mason, same question. When should the CEO get involved?
I think that both of them had great points, and that you need to identify at what point in the organization is that person the most credible spokesperson. Yes, as the CEO, you are the leader of that organization, but if it's, again, isolated to a specific department, then maybe that head is the most credible spokesperson in that situation and will be able to most accurately address those issues. We used to do that all the time within the university. While yes, we had dedicated chief spokespeople, sometimes we would enable the person who was really at the heart of that specific issue to speak on it because it was more authentic. We showed support from that chief leadership because we didn't want the perception of them not being involved to start getting out there. But again, we enabled everyone when they were the most likely and most credible person to be able to be that spokesperson. And that's something that I think every organization can do.
Jeff, I'm going to change the question slightly. What do you think are the pros and cons of having the CEO involved?
Yeah, good point. I think my rule, although it's absolutely subject to change, is the more bad the news, if you will, in terms of having to be conveyed, the more important is to either have the CEO be the spokesperson or someone at a very high level. I think the CEO delivering bad news shows the level of care and the level of commitment to solving whatever it is a problem for the organization. I do think the other level of commitment that the CEO has to show is before crisis emerges with supporting the organization developing a crisis communication or crisis management plan. If you don't have that buy-in from the get-go, it's going to show up in its execution as well, and that's often where a lot of the problems lie is, wait, it didn't happen to us or it won't happen to us, so why do we have to plan for it? And that's my biggest hurdle, at least personally speaking, getting organizations to work with us in developing those plans. But I agree with my cohorts here that you must train folks, CEOs especially, before crisis emerges to practice their talking points and their key messages so they're not learning on-the-job training. But they should be on the team, or a representative of the CEO, I believe, should be on the team and very involved from the get-go.
Okay, one more viewer question. And you can keep sending them in to us. I think Jeff, Dave, and Mason will do their best to answer them via Twitter if you have any others, but we've time for one more. This person says, I'm thinking about the most effective way to handle social media during a communications crisis, especially with multiple locations in several cities. Are there any special tools to utilize, keyword searches, Google alerts, etc.? So I think their problem is, how do you manage a local crisis in one city and try to prevent it maybe from having an impact in other cities? Dave, I'll start with you. Thoughts?
First of all, Google Alerts is great. I set Google Alerts for my phone. It's not just for crisis, just to see what my company is doing, and just read good stories about us. I mean, that's just good practice anyway. But I think it's you want to make the most important thing is making sure you're with one voice, that you don't have your remote location responding when this other location thinks they're the ones who are supposed to be responding, and either got rid of two different messages. But you don't want to have, it's just complicated, two different people always going back and forth. So you got to make sure that your remote location and the hub location are on the same page. Of who owns this, right? That's number one. And I think it's important also that if you're the remote location, that you very good at conveying back to the head location the gravity of it, because you have a much better sense what the media is like. You have better contacts, you have a better grasp of where this could go, and you have to be very forthright about that. Don't say, "Oh, I got this handled," if you really don't, or you know what, this is an isolated case. It's not the first time. This is an overzealous reporter who always gets his facts wrong. I mean, whatever it is, you need to convey that message back and make sure that they're fully informed as to how you plan to handle this or how you should handle it.
Jeff, thoughts on this, handling crisis across multiple locations?
I'm going to say something that I feel old saying this, but there's nothing like picking up the phone and actually having a conversation with your counterparts in other offices and so forth. We, and I'm as guilty as anybody, depend so much on email, text, Twitter, Facebook. We neglect to sometimes have authentic conversations with those who can express using tone, using in their voice. And these are our colleagues I'm talking about a reporter, about a situation, the nuances that can be messed up in a written communication. Interpersonal communication still has a place, and we cannot, especially in issue or crisis management, where things are so important to respond in an effective manner. So, I echo everything that Dave said for sure, and I agree 100% that local is so important. Reporters, there's just a sense of, I hear often, and I'm sure you guys all do too, that journalists will say, yeah, that New York PR firm, they called us, and there's almost like a Philly, at least in our town, like a sense of we want to support our own. I actually think that goes a long way, and I would say that's probably the case in other cities as well, but in our region, I would argue, having lived in 3 or 4 different places so far, that it's even more important. So those are the things that I think are important in terms of how you localize something that may be more national and how you can effectively communicate beyond just electronic.
Got it. Mason, any additional thoughts on this topic?
No, I think they summed it up great.
Awesome. So rapid fire, last question. You guys each have 10 or 15 seconds to answer it. What is the one thing that you hope the audience takes away from this conversation today? Dave.
On the spot.
Your crisis communication plan starts now. Cultivating good contacts, making them know that you're a good company, show them generate goodwill and equity, that when something does happen, that you're going to get the benefit of the doubt, at least from the jump. And that can go a long way.
Thanks. Jeff, one thing.
Oh, one thing. That's all right. I'm going to do 3 things. I'm sorry, I'm cheating. 2 of them are repeats. Perception is reality. Mm-hmm. Number 2, every crisis is an actual opportunity. Don't forget that. And number 3, and this is thanks to Slice here, technology can be a crisis, and how this worked really well. But think about it, everybody, for a second. What if this didn't work? What if we couldn't communicate on our webinar, which thankfully is not a crisis, but if it was something that we were speaking overseas and it didn't work? So these folks, I can say, and they didn't. This is an unpaid message. They practiced in advance. We did all the technology, so this would come off seamlessly. Don't forget that in having to deal with crises or deal with reporters or deal with your colleagues, where technology is important.
Thanks. And Mason, one thing.
I think when you are responding to a media inquiry and you don't have all the information, tell them that you don't have it, but then also tell them exactly what you're doing to find out or when you're going to know. Because that goes a long way, not only for that reporter to have trust, but also for those readers who are seeing that statement.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you guys to this incredible panel for all of your insights, all of your best practices, and for walking us through some real-life examples, because we all learn best that way. That's all the time we have for today. This webinar in its entirety will be saved on our website. So if there's a piece that you missed and you want to go back and look at it or share it with a friend or just look at a clip, feel free to do that. You can also send our panelists follow-up questions. Our team here at SLICE is planning future webinars, and we would love to know what marketing, PR, social media, or communications topics you'd like us to address in the future. So feel free always to tweet at us at SliceCom. You can also contact us through our website or send us a message on LinkedIn, email, Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook. I think the list goes on. Thanks so much to everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.